Today in the Daily Dose, the Civil Rights Movement. Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery in 1818 Talbot County, Maryland, Frederick Douglass was sold repeatedly as a boy and a young man, eventually landing in Baltimore, where housewife Sophia Auld taught him the alphabet. After he taught himself how to read and write, Douglass was sold to brutal slave owner Edward Covey after Douglass was caught teaching reading and writing to other slaves in the city. Flogged repeatedly by Covey, after several failed escape attempts, Douglass made his way to freedom, first into New York before settling in Massachusetts, where he married Anna Murray in 1838, beginning a loving union that witnessed the birth of 5 children. In 1843, Douglass joined the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions Project, where he spent 6 months in various American cities, delivering speeches on abolition that frequently led to physical assaults against him, including a broken hand in Pendleton, Indiana, that permanently limited the use of his right hand. Authoring multiple autobiographies about his journey from slavery to freedom, Douglass delivered abolitionist speeches as far afield as Ireland and the United Kingdom, where he said in his London reception speech, "What is to be thought of a nation boasting of its liberty, boasting of its humanity, boasting of its Christianity, boasting of its love of justice and purity, and yet having within its own borders 3 millions of persons denied by law the right of marriage?" By 1847, Douglass began publishing his own abolitionist newsletter called the North Star, at the same time championing the women's rights movement by attending the first women's suffrage gathering, now known as the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. During and after the Civil War, Douglass served in many official government positions, including the first African-American ambassador to the Dominican Republic. He also became the first African-American to receive a vote for President of the United States during the Republican National Convention of 1888, passing away in 1895 from a heart attack he suffered on his return home from a National Council of Women meeting in Washington, D.C., making the life and convictions of Frederick Douglass an early voice in a nation's slow embrace of equal rights. The Opelousas Massacre. During the peak years of post-Civil War Reconstruction, in 1868, the Republican-majority Louisiana state legislature ratified a new constitution, coattailing the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution by granting citizenship rights to recently emancipated African Americans, leading white carpetbaggers like 18-year-old Ohio teacher Emerson Bentley to help blacks in Opelousas, Louisiana, achieve economic, political, and educational parity with whites. Unwilling to cede power to newly freed African Americans, white Democrats in St. Landry Parish, the most populous parish in the state, pushed back against Republican-led Reconstruction efforts by joining hate groups like the Knights of the White Camellia, the Innocents, the Seymour Knights, and the Ku Klux Klan. As white vigilante groups inflicted violence against blacks and white Republicans, on September 13, 1868, Republicans held a meeting in Washington, Louisiana, not far from Opelousas, which soon turned into an angry face-off with armed Seymour Knights. A misfired rifle elevated tensions to near riot conditions, only to de-escalate when Bentley agreed to publish an honest accounting of events in the city's leading Republican newspaper, the St. Landry Progress. Instead, Bentley's published testimony of Republican intimidation by white Democrats furthered the wrath of white hate groups, leading to an outbreak of violence on September 28th, after rumors of an armed black uprising brought back generational fears of mass slave revolts against white slaveholders. With black lives no longer valued as slaves, on the first night of violence, 29 African American men were taken to a local prison, leading to the summary execution of 27 men without due process or trial. Unremitting bloodshed continued over the next 2 weeks, witnessing the deaths of African Americans in their homes or on the streets of Opelousas, including the public murder of C.E. Durand, the white editor-in-chief of the St. Landry Progress. By the time the violence ended, more than 250 people, the vast majority African American, were dead, effectively reversing Reconstruction-era gains for freed blacks in Louisiana. During the city's 2 weeks of racial homicide, all Republican-leaning newspapers were burned to the ground, and while Republican presidential candidate Ulysses S. Grant handily won the White House that same year, not a single Republican vote was counted in St. Landry Parish, making the Opelousas Massacre of 1868 yet another stain on America's slow embrace of equal rights. Jim Crow laws in the segregated South. Named after a black minstrel show character, Jim Crow laws were a collection of mostly Southern state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation, which were implemented shortly after the end of the Civil War and lasted until the civil rights protests and federal legislation of the 1960s. The laws were intended to marginalize African Americans by suppressing their right to vote, limiting their access to good-paying jobs, while excluding access to higher education. Those who attempted to shirk the laws often faced arrest, fines, jail time, violence, and even death. In 1896, the first legal attempt to repeal Jim Crow laws was upheld in the case of Plessy v Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal doctrine, affirming racial segregation in public facilities, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were routinely inferior and underfunded compared to facilities maintained exclusively for whites. While the laws as a whole institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans living in the South, segregation was also adhered to in the U.S. military, while in 1913, Southern Democratic President Woodrow Wilson initiated national segregation policies in federal workplaces. Southern statutes continued to impose poll taxes on black Americans, attempting to suppress them from voting in local, state, and national elections. In 1954, segregation of state-funded public schools was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education. Yet most Southern states dragged their feet for years before integration was finally achieved, against great backlash from white Southerners. In 1964, the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow laws in other cases such as Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. versus United States. The last vestiges of Jim Crow laws came to an end when they were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, bringing to an end white America's long and stained history of racial suppression against black Americans. Plessy v Ferguson. After the Compromise of 1877 ended post-Civil War Reconstruction efforts in the South, Southern blacks saw the promise of equality granted to them by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments crushed under a rising tide of segregationist black codes. Much like the Freedom Riders of 1961, who would follow their lead, who used whites-only facilities in bus terminals as a stress test to the Supreme Court's 1960 Boycott v. Virginia ruling declaring segregation inside interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional, after Louisiana mandated segregated railway cars in 1890, backed by other pre-civil rights movement activists, Homer Adolph Plessy, agreed to set out by train to challenge the new law, boarding a whites-only rail car on June 7, 1892, departing New Orleans for the sleepy North Shore community of Covington, Louisiana. Despite his mixed-race ethnicity, Plessy claiming he was 7/8 Caucasian, when a conductor insisted he leave the car, Plessy refused, leading to his prompt arrest and imprisonment. Convicted by a New Orleans court for violating state law, Plessy filed a petition against the Honorable John H. Ferguson, the presiding judge over his trial, claiming that the state's 1890 law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and as segregationist laws continued to accelerate throughout the Jim Crow South, including congressional nullification of many Reconstruction-era laws, Plessy's persistent tenacity elevated his case to the Supreme Court. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court at last issued its ruling on Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that separate but equal facilities were indeed constitutional on intrastate railroads, insisting that the protections laid down by the 14th Amendment applied solely to political and civil rights freedoms, such as voting and jury duty, yet had no bearing over, as the justices phrased it, social rights freedoms. Addressing Plessy's argument that segregated black rail cars were necessarily inferior, Justice Henry Brown wrote that we consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it, making Plessy v. Ferguson an open-season invitation. Woodrow Wilson's racist policies. While Woodrow Wilson was lauded by most Americans for his leadership during the First World War, as well as his progressive reforms for American business and labor, his upbringing in antebellum Virginia tainted his views on race and segregation, which followed him all the way to the White House. For instance, in his 5-volume history series, A History of the American People, his written views on the institution of slavery adheres to what historians have called a lost cause narrative of the antebellum South, insisting that slavery was a gentle patrician affair, while recasting the Civil War as an issue of states' rights instead of slavery. His recorded views on post-Civil War Reconstruction further illuminate his racist bent, insisting that Reconstruction placed Southern white men under the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes, while casting the Ku Klux Klan as an invisible empire of the South, bound together in loose organization to protect the Southern country from some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution. When Wilson entered the White House in 1913, he allowed the Southern members of his cabinet to segregate the Treasury, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and the Government Printing Office, forcing the creation of separate offices, lunchrooms, and bathrooms for black federal employees, at the same time crushing whatever gains African Americans had made since the end of the Civil War. In a surviving transcript regarding an Oval Office meeting with civil rights activists Webb Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, whom Wilson angrily threw out of his office in 1914, Wilson argued that segregation is not humiliating, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen. Since Wilson's racist views have surfaced, institutions and politicians have grappled with his legacy, prompting Monmouth University officials in June of 2020 to announce their intentions to rename Woodrow Wilson Hall, while after years of protests, Princeton University plans to remove Wilson's name from its prestigious public policy school, announcing that his segregationist sympathies and policies made Wilson an especially inappropriate namesake, making the racist policies of Woodrow Wilson a backsliding disappointment for racial equality in early 20th century America. The Rosewood Massacre. Originally settled in 1845 by both black and white Americans alike, African Americans in Rosewood, Florida, would suffer the same black codes and Jim Crow segregation laws as any other post-Civil War blacks in the southern U.S. After most whites in Rosewood moved to nearby Sumner by the 1890s, on New Year's Day, 1923, 22-year-old Fannie Taylor claimed she was assaulted in her home by a black man, and when Sheriff Walker did little to find the perpetrator, Fannie's outraged husband gathered a white mob to hunt down the suspect. In response, white haters from Gainesville, including about 500 Ku Klux Klan members, descended on Rosewood, where law enforcement told them that a black prisoner named Jesse Hunter had escaped a chain gang, which set the mob in search of the missing prisoner. Convinced that Jesse Hunter was being hidden by Rosewood blacks, they forced Aaron Carrier out of his house, dragged him to Sumner behind a car, where he was cut loose and beaten to only inches of his life. When blacksmith Sam Carter confessed under duress that he had hidden the prisoner in some nearby woods, the mob shot him and hung him from a tree when he failed to produce the convict. After Sarah Carrier hid some 25 frightened black children in her house, she and her son were killed by white racists, which later set the mob to destroying Rosewood one home and business at a time. As the town burned to the ground, many surviving blacks hid themselves over the next few days in nearby swamps until Sarah Carrier's surviving son James led them to safety. For his alleged interference in helping his frightened brethren, the last of the white mob forced the Good Samaritan to dig his own grave before they murdered him. After Florida Governor Cary Hardy offered to send in the National Guard to restore order, Sheriff Walker declined the help, and while the white haters began to disperse, a group returned on January 7th to burn what little remained of the town. A special prosecutor and grand jury were appointed by Hardy to investigate, but after some 30 mostly white witnesses had testified, the jury was released after the prosecutor failed to find enough evidence for criminal prosecution. The surviving African Americans of Rosewood never returned after the killing spree and the destruction of their homes and businesses, making the Rosewood Massacre yet another stain in the South's long history of racial injustice. The Scottsboro Boys. During the darkest days of the Great Depression, desperate men and women hitched rides on freight trains in search of work. And when a fight broke out on a freight train in 1931 Scottsboro, Alabama, police arrested 9 black teenagers after 2 white women accused the boys of raping them on the train. In a case mired in the Jim Crow South, when news got out about the 9 accused teenagers, an angry white mob descended upon the Scottsboro jail, prompting a local sheriff to call in the Alabama National Guard over fears of an impending lynching. In April of that same year, an all-white, all-male jury returned lightning-fast guilty verdicts for what became known as the Scottsboro Boys, handing down the death penalty to 8, while 13-year-old Leroy Wright's trial resulted in a hung jury when one jurist favored a lesser sentence of life in prison. As news of the shaky convictions spread around the world, the boys' fate became a rallying cry for the International Labor Defense, the legal wing of the American Communist Party, leading to international demonstrations against Southern-style racism. And after the Alabama Supreme Court upheld the convictions of 7 defendants, in March of 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Powell v. Alabama that the boys' rights to due process under the 14th Amendment had been violated. After avowed rape victim Ruby Bates recanted much of her original testimony, the Scottsboro Boys continued their legal appeals through the Alabama court system, leading to a second trip to the U.S. Supreme Court in January of 1935, when the court again overturned the guilty verdicts in Norris v. Alabama, citing the systematic exclusion of blacks from Alabama juries, a landmark decision which helped to integrate future juries across the United States. Despite clear evidence regarding the boys' innocence, the recurring trials brought international condemnation of the South's racist bias against blacks, inspiring numerous books, songs, films, and stage plays about the boys' unjust imprisonment, including a clear link to Harper Lee's classic novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, making the Scottsboro Boys an early ignition point in the civil rights movement to come. Hatred and healing at the Burwood Wall. While many Detroit white men were off fighting World War I, African Americans migrated from northern and southern cities to fill the labor vacuum. But when white veterans returned home after the war, racial tensions began to rise over both jobs and housing, which only intensified during the lean years of the Great Depression. In 1941, attempting to respond to the housing shortage, a real estate developer in northwest Detroit faced a dilemma when he set out to build an all-white housing subdivision that butted up against a mostly African American neighborhood. When his bank turned down his construction loan application due to the potential for racial tension, he built the now infamous Burwood Wall as a physical separation between the two communities. Known as the Burwood Wall or Detroit's Wailing Wall, the half-mile structure covers 3 city blocks for the sole purpose of racial segregation. The wall begins across the street from the northern boundary of Van Antwerp Park on Pembroke Avenue between Burwood and Mundata Streets, extending north until just shy of 8 Mile Road. An exposed stretch of wall with no homes to the east runs through Alfonso Wells Memorial Playground between Chippewa Avenue and Norfolk Street. The Burwood Wall stands 5 feet tall by 1 foot thick, and while it originally served to divide two communities by the color of their skin, by 1971, residents on both sides of the wall were now predominantly black. After years of resentment over the Burwood Wall, in 2006, community activists and Detroit residents came together to flip the wall from a symbol of hatred to an act of healing, allowing artists to express themselves in murals, which include such varied depictions as a cappella singers and Rosa Parks' now infamous bus ride. In 2021, the wall was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, establishing the Burwood Wall not only as a reminder and recognition of America's racist past, but also of a new hope for lasting equality, now and into the future. Brown v. Board of Education. After the Supreme Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy V Ferguson, affirming that racially segregated public facilities were legal, provided facilities for blacks and whites were equal, the ruling cemented Jim Crow laws, particularly in the southern states, that would stand for the next 6 decades to come. By the early 1950s, however, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, began challenging steadfast segregation laws, filing lawsuits in states like South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, including a 1951 class action suit against the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education after Oliver Brown's daughter, Linda, was denied entrance into Topeka's all-white elementary schools. Citing the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, Brown's suit maintained that black schools were inferior to white schools, and while the U.S. District Court in Kansas agreed with Brown's claim, the court continued to uphold the separate but equal clause from Plessy v Ferguson. Reaching the Supreme Court in 1952, Brown's case was combined with 4 other similar challenges under the name Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, with NAACP's Thurgood Marshall serving as chief attorney for the plaintiffs, and while the Supreme Court justices were initially divided on a ruling, Chief Justice Fred M. Vinson firmly believing that the Plessy verdict should stand. After Vinson's death in September of 1953, new Chief Justice Earl Warren engineered a unanimous verdict against school segregation on May 17, 1954, ruling that segregated schools were inherently unequal. Known as Brown v. Board of Education II, in May of 1955, the Supreme Court issued a second opinion that remanded all future desegregation cases to the lower federal court system, an opinion that opened the door for local judicial and political evasion of desegregation laws and court opinions. The issue of desegregation would come to a head in 1957 Little Rock, Arkansas, when Governor Orville Faubus called in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent black students from attending Little Rock Central High School, obliging President Dwight D. Eisenhower to deploy federal troops to ensure that 9 black students were successfully integrated into the school. Continued white resistance to desegregation, however, did much to fuel the nascent civil rights movement in America, eventually leading to the eradication of Jim Crow laws in the South, making Brown v. Board of Education a landmark ruling in a nation's slow embrace of racial equality. Emmett Till. Born in 1941, Chicago, Illinois, to a single mother who by all accounts was a hard-working and quite extraordinary woman. When Emmett Till was just 14 years old, he traveled to Money, Mississippi to visit his great-uncle Moses Wright. 3 days after his arrival, on August 24, 1955, Emmett and a group of teenagers entered Bryant's grocery and meat market after a long and hot day of picking cotton. Emmett purchased some bubble gum, while some of his buddies later reported that he either whistled at, flirted with, or touched the hand of Carolyn Bryant, the cashier and wife of business owner Roy Bryant. 4 days later, at 2:30 a.m. on August 28th, Roy Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, kidnapped Emmett from Wright's home, beating the teenager without mercy. After they shot him in the head, they used barbed wire to tie Emmett's mangled body to a large metal fan, dumping him unceremoniously into the Tallahatchie River. When Emmett's unconsolable mother shipped her son's body home to Chicago, she insisted on a 5-day open casket viewing, in her words, to let the world see what has happened. 2 black publications, Jet Magazine and the Chicago Defender, published graphic images of Emmett's mangled corpse, igniting a tidal wave of outrage and indignation throughout a horrified nation. At a time when black people and women were barred from jury duty, Bryant and Millam were tried for murder before an all-white, all-male jury, and despite graphic testimony by Moses Wright, one of the earliest cases of a black person openly accusing a white man in a court of law, despite overwhelming evidence of the defendant's guilt, on September 23rd, the jurors acquitted Bryant and Millam after a mere 67 minutes of deliberation. A few months later, in return for a $4,000 payday from Look magazine, Bryant and Millam openly admitted their guilt in the murder of Emmett Lewis Till. Despite the blatant injustice of Emmett's death and his white murderer's escape from retribution, Emmett's death sparked an early ignition point in the American civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 60s, propelling leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X to the height of a nation's shameful look at its white-inspired segregationist behavior. 50 years after Emmett's wrongful murder, 72-year-old Carolyn Bryant Donham recanted parts of her testimony from her husband's trial, admitting to author Timothy B. Tyson that nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him. Her confession that Emmett never grabbed or sexually harassed her remained dormant for another 10 years, until the book's eventual publication in 2017, making the death of Emmett Till a tragic and early flashpoint in a nation's slow embrace of racial equality. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was commuting home after a long day as a working seamstress, seated in the front row of the segregated blacks-only back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. When the front of the bus filled up with too many white passengers, driver J. Fred Blake asked Parks and 3 others to vacate their seats, and while the other riders complied, Parks had reached a tipping point in the segregated South. Refusing to give up her seat, she was promptly arrested and fined $14. Her arrest would trigger a second tipping point when black civil rights leaders and black bus riders alike kicked off a bus boycott, demanding equal rights as American citizens. Upon her arrest, Parks phoned Edie Nixon, a prominent black leader, who bailed her out before convincing 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, to lead and inspire the first major civil rights protest in America. Roughly 40,000 black bus riders boycotted the Montgomery bus system beginning on December 5th, which represented 75% of all bus riders in the southern city of 120,000 residents. Initially, the protesters' demands did not include changing the segregation laws, but rather the group demanded courtesy, the hiring of black drivers, and a first-come, first-seated policy, with whites entering and filling the seats at the front of the bus, while blacks entered and sat in the rear. Ultimately, however, a group of 5 black Montgomery women affiliated with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, sued the city, seeking to have busing segregation laws totally invalidated. As a result of Montgomery's bus boycott, on June 5, 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled that any law requiring racially segregated seating violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was adopted after the Civil War and guaranteed all Americans, regardless of race, equal rights and equal protection under state and federal laws. The city of Montgomery appealed the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which upheld the lower court's decision on December 20, 1956. The boycott ended the following day, 381 days after it began. The Little Rock Nine.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
While racism remains an issue in America even to this day, it's important to note and comprehend that forward progress, particularly in the Jim Crow South of the 1950s, was the result of individuals who stood up for their constitutional rights, pushing through divisive barriers established by angry segregationists. In September of 1957, 9 black schoolchildren, the eldest only 17, stood up to angry backlash during a time of public school integration, seeking a better education for themselves while pursuing the American dream previously set aside for whites only in the segregated South.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now from their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
They were Thelma Mothershed, Minnie Jean Brown, Jefferson Thomas, Terrence Roberts, Carlotta Walls, Gloria Ray, Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, and Melba Patillo, known collectively as the Little Rock Nine. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown v. Board of Education found segregation of schools unconstitutional, but as the Little Rock Nine approached their newly integrated high school in Little Rock, segregationists stormed the campus in protest.
They got no business out here. This is our school, not theirs. They are their own.
As the violence escalated, Elizabeth Eckford was heckled by an angry mob who yelled, lynch her," as she walked calmly toward the entrance to the school. President Dwight D. Eisenhower soon intervened, setting a precedent for the nation as a whole.
Extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise.
On September 25, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs of segregationist haters, boldly making their way into the classrooms of Little Rock Central High School.
You feel it's worth it going through this?
Yes, I do.
These 9 heroes were willing to step forward in the name of racial equality, not to mention a head-down chipping away at the oppression's pandemic in the Jim Crow South. Martin Luther King Jr. Born into a family of distinguished pastors at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. attended segregated public schools in Georgia before receiving his BA from predominantly black Morehouse College. He then went on to attend the predominantly white Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he was elected class president before winning a fellowship that enabled him to pursue his doctorate at Boston University. In Boston, he met and married Coretta Scott, raising 2 sons and 2 daughters, as Martin Luther pursued his preaching career at Ebenezer Baptist and the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. By age 35, Martin Luther had already won the Nobel Prize for Peace. Martin Luther soon became one of the leading figures in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, spearheading the 328-day Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white bus passenger on December 1, 1955. For his very public activism in Montgomery, Martin Luther was arrested over 20 times during his activist career before his home was bombed by white haters, and despite endless threats to his life, Martin Luther would propel the civil rights movement with his gifts behind the pulpit.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
As head of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, Martin Luther would go on to lead numerous civil rights campaigns and marches, including the March on Washington, the Birmingham Campaign, as well as violence-riddled marches on Selma and Montgomery. He also led the Chicago Open Housing Movement, the Memphis Sanitation Worker Strike, and the Poor People's Campaign, authoring 5 books in between traveling over 6 million miles from 1957 to 1968, delivering no less than 2,500 speeches in support of equal rights. Many historians believe that Martin Luther's open criticism of America's participation in the Vietnam War split his message as a civil rights leader, leading to the rise of a different sort of black activists, such as Malcolm X, who opposed King's adherence to Gandhi-style nonviolent protest techniques. On April 4, 1968, after delivering one of the most powerful speeches of his life to the Memphis sanitation workers the night before, Martin Luther's life was unjustly taken at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, as he and others were leaving for dinner, felled before his time by assassin James Earl Ray. The Greensboro Four makes civil rights history. When 4 black college students refused to vacate a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, the civil rights sit-in movement of 1960 would spread across the South like wildfire, elevating the civil rights movement to a new level of national awareness. Influenced heavily by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent protest philosophy, Ethel Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil refused to vacate a Woolworth lunch counter after they were refused service for the color of their skin. All 4 were students from the nearby North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, while their activist agenda was further inspired by the Freedom Riders, who tested the clout of the Supreme Court's recent decision banning segregation on interstate bus travel. Other underlying motivation came from the brutal 1955 murder of Emmett Till, who had allegedly whistled at a white woman in a Mississippi store. Assisted by local white businessman Ralph Jones, on February 1, 1960, the 4 students sat down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's, where the official policy was to refuse service to anyone but whites. When the 4 young men refused to leave, police were called to the scene, but were unable to take any action due to the complete lack of provocation on the part of the 4 students. By that time, Johns had alerted local media, who arrived in full force to cover the events on television. The 4 stayed until the store closed for the night, returning the next day with more student activists from other local colleges. By February 5th, some 300 students had joined the protest at Woolworth's, paralyzing the lunch counter and other downtown businesses. Heavy television coverage of the Greensboro sit-ins sparked a sit-in movement that spread rapidly to college towns throughout the South and then up into the North, as young blacks and whites joined in various forms of peaceful protest against segregationist policies, including libraries, beaches, hotels, and other whites-only establishments. While white pushback was frequently contentious, by the end of March, the movement had spread to 55 cities in 13 states, forcing previously segregated enterprises to quietly integrate by the summer of 1960. Today, the former Greensboro Woolworths, where the first sit-in took place, now houses the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, which features a restored version of the lunch counter where the Greensboro Four first sat, while part of the original lunch counter is now on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Medgar Evers. Born in 1925 Decatur, Mississippi, Medgar Evers served with the U.S. Army during World War II, participating in the D-Day invasions at Normandy, France, before enrolling in present-day Alcorn State University, graduating in 1952 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Business Administration. Moving to Mound Bayou, Mississippi with his young wife Merle, Evers worked as a salesman for the Magnolia Mutual Life Insurance Company, at the same time becoming president of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, where his civil rights activism led to the boycott of Mississippi gas stations that banned blacks from using their restrooms. Following the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, which ruled that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, Evers submitted his application as a test case to the state-supported University of Mississippi Law School, which was summarily rejected due to the color of his skin.
And they want me to tell you that we don't need nigger business. These are stories that help to support the White Citizens Council, the council that is dedicated to keeping you and I second-class citizens. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be demonstrating here until freedom comes to Negroes here in Jackson, Mississippi.
That same year, Evers was named the first NAACP Field Secretary of Mississippi, where his mounting civil rights activism, including his public investigation of the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, Evers and his young family lived with the constant threat of death from racist white hate groups, including the White Citizens Council created to block segregation of public schools, and the Ku Klux Klan. In May of 1963, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the carport of his Jackson home, while on June 7th of that same year, Evers was nearly run down by a car after leaving the Jackson office of the NAACP. 5 days later, just hours after President John F. Kennedy delivered a nationally televised civil rights address, Evers was assassinated by avowed segregationist Byron de la Beckwith, who was subsequently acquitted by 2 all-white juries in February and April of 1964.
I believe in extermination of all that opposes the white, right, Christian side of every issue. It's like Martin Luther King. You know, nobody has had any trouble with Martin Luther King since they put him in the coffin.
Refusing to give up the fight for justice for her fallen husband, Myrlie Evers sought a retrial based on new evidence in 1994, leading to Beckwith's February 5th conviction of murder, a full 3 decades after he ended Evers' life with a World War I-era Eddystone Enfield rifle. Beckwith appealed his conviction in 1997, which was later upheld by the Mississippi Supreme Court, passing away in prison on January 21, 2001, making the activist's life and tragic death of Medgar Evers an early ignition point in a nation's slow embrace of equal rights. The Freedom Riders of 1961. Willing to sacrifice their physical safety as a challenge to the Supreme Court's 1960 ruling in Boynton v. Virginia, which declared segregation inside interstate transportation facilities unconstitutional, a group of 7 African Americans and 6 white civil rights activists set out on a bus ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, intending to use whites-only bathrooms, lunch counters, and waiting rooms as a stress test for the new law. The group traveled through Virginia and North Carolina with little notice, but in Rock Hill, South Carolina, 3 of the Freedom Riders, including future Congressman John Lewis, were violently attacked as they entered a whites-only waiting area. Traveling on to Atlanta, the group divided their numbers onto 2 separate buses, and when the first group arrived in Anniston, Alabama, a mob of 200 white haters harassed the bus in cars when the bus driver refused to enter the station. After the tires were blown out, the Greyhound was firebombed, followed by brutal beatings for the Freedom Riders as they escaped the burning bus. The Freedom Riders on the Trailways bus met a similar fate in Birmingham, where they were beaten by a white mob brandishing metal pipes. Even after newspaper images of bloodied riders and the torched bus caused outrage around the world, the reunited Freedom Riders saw violence yet again in Birmingham, where a white mob attacked the riders with baseball bats and clubs, prompting Attorney General Robert Kennedy to call in 600 federal marshals to quell the violence. The following night, Martin Luther King Jr. led a service at the First Baptist Church of Montgomery, where more than 1,000 came out in support of the Freedom Riders. And when another riot ensued outside the church, King called Robert Kennedy, requesting protection from angry white haters. Kennedy responded with more federal marshals, who used tear gas to disperse the crowd of violent racists. After the Freedom Riders left Birmingham by Greyhound, several hundred supporters greeted them upon their arrival in Jackson, Mississippi, where any and all activists were arrested for trespassing, following their attempts to enter whites-only facilities. The freedom rides were continued by copycatters into the fall of 1961, spurred on by continued national and international attention, while the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations against segregated transit terminals in response to steady pressure by the Kennedy administration, placing the Freedom Riders center stage against the lead foot of the Jim Crow South. Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little in 1925 Omaha, Nebraska, Malcolm X dropped out of school after the 8th grade, earning the nickname Detroit Red for dealing drugs in flashy zoot suits. Convicted of larceny at age 21, during his 6-year prison sentence, Malcolm X was exposed to the teachings of Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad, who preached that white people were the devil. Abandoning his slave name for the simple last name of X, after his release from prison, Malcolm became the minister of Harlem's Mosque No. 7, where his skills as an orator grew the Nation of Islam from 400 members in 1952 to over 40,000 by 1960, including an African-American heavyweight boxer who changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary. The injustice that has been inflicted upon Negroes in this country by Uncle Sam is criminal. I'm not an integrationist, never could be. I couldn't integrate with my enemy, and I know who my enemy is. We don't want to have anything to do with any race of dog, two-legged dog, that will sick four-legged dogs on innocent, harmless women, children, and babies.
An advocate for achieving racial equality by any means necessary, his persistent calls for violence against the white man placed him at odds with Martin Luther King Jr.'s insistence on nonviolent protest during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, at the same time placing Malcolm X on the FBI's watch list of subversives, prompting Bureau Chief J. Edgar Hoover to encourage New York agents to do something about Malcolm X. Suspended from the Nation of Islam over his charge of corruption within the organization, in 1964, Malcolm traveled to Mecca, where he experienced a profound spiritual transformation, including his eventual name change to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. Founding the Organization of Afro-American Unity in June of 1964, Malcolm X's adoption of a more moderate philosophy soon found resonance with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, after he identified racism instead of the white race as the true enemy of justice. Less than a year later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by Nation of Islam members during a unity rally at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City, a revenge killing for Malcolm's public criticism of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, making the short yet impassioned life of Malcolm X one of the leading voices during the Civil Rights Movement in America. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Born in 1908 Central Texas, Lyndon Baines Johnson graduated from Southwest State Teachers College while paying for his education by teaching disadvantaged Mexican-American students in South Texas, providing young Johnson with a first-hand taste of poverty and discrimination that would later bear fruit for a nation's disadvantaged poor. Moving to Washington, D.C. as a congressional secretary for Texas Representative Richard Kleberg, Johnson met and married Claudia Alta Lady Bird Taylor, who would later become a critical part of Johnson's political success. His political career took off in earnest in 1937, when he was elected to the House of Representatives as a Democrat, becoming the first member of Congress to volunteer into the military when the United States entered World War II in 1941, serving as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy until all members of Congress were recalled to Washington in the summer of 1942. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948 by a narrow margin of just 87 votes, Johnson became a driving force in Congress with his knack for pushing through key pieces of legislation, serving first as the minority leader of the Senate, followed by Senate Majority Leader when Democrats took control of Congress in 1955. Despite bad blood between Johnson and the Kennedys, in 1960, John F. Kennedy asked Johnson to be his running mate for his successful bid for the White House, only to be sworn in as president following JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963, an event which gutted a nation to its core. Johnson quickly declared a war on poverty in America, pushing Congress to pass legislation addressing illiteracy, unemployment, and racial discrimination. Winning a second term by more than 15 million votes over Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, Johnson launched his Great Society campaign, which created Medicare and Medicaid and federal health insurance for the elderly and the poor, at the same time combating ongoing Jim Crow racial prejudice by signing the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A firm believer in the now discredited domino theory regarding the spread of communism, Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War made him widely unpopular with the American voting public, leading to his decision not to run for re-election in the presidential season of 1968. He retired to his ranch in Texas to write his memoir and to establish his presidential library, passing away from a heart attack on January 22, 1973, making the life and politics of Lyndon Baines Johnson a mixed bag of social advances on the home front amidst a deepening war in Southeast Asia. Freedom Summer. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial, the Jim Crow South remained staunchly segregated, especially at the voting booth, where segregationist lawmakers instituted poll taxes and literacy tests intended to stymie Black Americans' constitutional rights. Most glaring was Mississippi, where only 7% of the state's eligible blacks had successfully registered to vote.
I don't want the Negro as I have known him and contacted him during my lifetime to control the making of the law that controls me, to control the government under which I live.
Calling for civil rights activists to descend on Mississippi with the intent of registering black voters, Mississippi Project Director Bob Moses insisted on nonviolence in all situations. However, when the first 300 volunteers arrived on June 15, 1964, two white students from New York, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, and local black activist James Chaney, quickly disappeared during a visit to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where they had gone to investigate the burning of a black church. Despite this quite troubling development, the volunteers pushed ahead with their registration efforts, receiving pushback and violence at almost every turn. The badly beaten and bullet-riddled remains of the missing volunteers were recovered, killed by a Ku Klux Klan lynch mob that had the full protection and support by local police. National and international outrage would follow, citing zero federal protection and a slow investigation by local authorities, the FBI, and 400 Navy sailors. While Freedom Summer did little to increase black voter participation, a mere 1,200 successful registrants out of 17,000 attempted tries, public outcry combined with the 1964 Democratic National Convention, where delegates from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party were refused entry. The two events helped to persuade President Lyndon Baines Johnson and Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation in public places while banning employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Next would come the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed racial discrimination voting laws in the segregated South. Of the 18 white men suspected of being involved in the brutal murders, only 8 were charged. 7 would eventually be convicted, receiving relatively minor puppet sentences for their crimes. Ruby Bridges. Born during the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, just 3 months and 21 days after the Supreme Court's 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education, at the age of 5, Ruby Bridges attended a segregated kindergarten until significant federal pressure forced the Orleans Parish School District to admit black children into all-white segregated schools. In early 1960, Bridges was one of 6 black children in New Orleans who passed a test to determine whether they could attend the all-white William Frantz Elementary School, a test primarily designed to slow and impede desegregation efforts. 2 stayed at their old school, 3 transferred to another all-white school, while Ruby Bridges alone attended William Frantz Elementary. On November 14, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby and her mother Lucille approached Frantz Elementary despite a throng of angry white protesters who threw objects and shouted angry racist epitaphs. Escorted into school by 4 federal marshals, years later, Charles Burks, one of the marshals in attendance, recalled that Ruby showed a lot of courage. She never cried, she didn't whimper, she just marched along like a little soldier, and we're all so very proud of her. White parents quickly began pulling their children out of classrooms, obliging Barbara Henry, a teacher from Boston, Massachusetts, to teach Bridges for an entire year on a one-on-one basis. A day later, Methodist minister Lloyd Anderson Foreman was the first white parent to escort his 5-year-old daughter past the angry mob, until one by one, white students returned to Frantz Elementary to resume their studies. During the early days of desegregation in New Orleans schools, as Bridges walked to school each morning, one white woman repeatedly threatened to poison her, while another held up a black baby doll in a coffin, until even the worst racist haters began to accept the inevitability of the federal government's desegregation mandates. Today, Ruby Bridges has published 4 books on her youthful story and the ongoing need for racial tolerance and acceptance, at the same time receiving many honorable degrees and awards along the way. Now chair of the Ruby Bridges Foundation, the group's mission is to promote the values of tolerance, respect, and appreciation of all differences. Racism is a grown-up disease, Bridges maintains, and we must stop using our children to spread it, making Ruby Bridges one of the leading voices in America's slow embrace of racial equality. Selma's Bloody Sunday. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, nearly a century after the abolition of slavery in America, civil rights activists focused their attention on Dallas County, Alabama, where more than half the population was black, yet less than 2% of black residents were registered to vote. On Sunday, March 7th, activist John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Uzziah Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Council led some 600 protesters from the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma on a planned 54-mile march to Alabama's capital city of Montgomery in an attempt to meet directly with Alabama Governor George Wallace in a high-profile appeal for African American voting rights. Walking through Selma unimpeded, when the protesters reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate general and reputed Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan, the marchers were stopped by state police, wearing riot gear and gas masks. as they slapped their billy clubs against their hands in open anticipation, while spectators waved Confederate flags with an equal sense of impending violence. It would be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, Major John Cloud called out through a bullhorn. This is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse. Go home or go to your church. Instead, when the marchers failed to turn around, the troopers advanced like a phalanx of hate, brutally assaulting the protesters with clubs, bullwhips, and rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire, all in front of news cameras who captured the violence amid an uproar of cheers from reveling white bystanders. Although ultimately forced back, in the spirit of nonviolent protest advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi before him, the marchers refused to fight back. Hours later, when ABC News anchor Frank Reynolds interrupted the network's star-studded premiere of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, nearly 50 million Americans witnessed the brutal savagery of what would become known as Bloody Sunday. Outrage swept a slowly awakening nation, leading to sit-ins and demonstrations of white solidarity, making Selma's Bloody Sunday a turning point moment in a nation's slow embrace of equal rights. The Black Panthers. Following the assassination of black nationalist leader Malcolm X and the murder of an unarmed black teen by San Francisco police, activists Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panthers or Black Panther Party in October of 1966, which was a socialist, armed self-defense group with the primary goal of pushing back on police brutality against blacks. Taking advantage of a California law that allowed citizens to carry fully loaded, unconcealed guns, the Black Panthers began shadowing Oakland police with guns at the ready, representing a clear break from the integrationist goals and nonviolent protest tactics of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Spreading quickly to other American cities with large minority populations, by 1968, the Black Panthers had grown to some 2,000 members, spreading Newton and Seale's political objectives drawn up in their 10-point program, including the immediate end to police brutality, employment for African Americans, fair housing, and justice for all. While the Panthers were able to institute community social programs such as free breakfast for school children and free health clinics in 13 African American communities, the group soon bogged down into violence, including Panther treasurer Bobby Hutton's death in a shootout with police in April of 1968, followed by Newton's conviction and imprisonment for killing Oakland police officer John Fry. The Panthers' socialist message and militant tactics soon made them a target of the FBI's secret counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO, leading FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to call the Black Panthers one of the greatest threats to the nation's internal security. Hoover's declaration triggered an open season by police against the Panthers in each of their chapter cities, leading to the 1969 murder of Panther members Fred Hampton and Mark Clark during an ambush by Chicago police. Killed while sleeping in their apartment, a ballistics investigation into the more than 100 rounds fired in the apartment determined that only one round came from the Panther side of the exchange. After a federal grand jury ruled that the Bureau played a significant role in the lead-up to the raid, the Black Panthers officially disbanded in 1982, making the Black Panther Party a violent participant during the turbulent years of the American 60s. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final speech. On Wednesday, April 3, 1968, the community of Memphis, Tennessee spent the day under siege by strong winds and violent thunderstorms. After a bomb threat had delayed his flight from Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. and his contemporaries from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference checked in at the Lorraine Hotel in advance of a sanitation workers' rally at the Mason Temple that night, followed by a planned protest march the following Monday. Doc, as he was affectionately known to his colleagues, checked into his usual room at the Lorraine, room 306, with his habitual roommate Ralph Abernathy at his side. Out on the rain-soaked streets, the Memphis police set up a dragnet around the hotel, doing what they could to protect the famed Nobel laureate and civil rights legend from untold threats by white racists intent on silencing MLK's message of nonviolent protest. Barely installed in room 306, 2 officers from the Memphis Sheriff's Department arrived to serve Dr. King with an injunction issued by the Fifth Circuit Court of Tennessee, indicating that next Monday's planned sanitation workers' march had been banned. Combined with the bomb threat, Doc asked Abernathy and Jesse Jackson to stand in for him at the Mason Temple that night, while he turned in early for some much-needed sleep. Hours later, Doc awakened to the sound of his hotel room phone, and when he answered it, Abernathy informed him that the overcapacity crowd at the temple refused to take no for an answer regarding a morale-boosting speech by the civil rights legend. In response, Doc dressed in a suit and cabbed over to the church for what would become his final speech before his life was unjustly ended the following day.
What we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. So just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next day, stealing off with Abernathy for lunch at one of MLK's favorite fried catfish joints, Doc confessed to his friend that he hadn't prepared for last night's monumental speech, but rather he let the Holy Spirit guide his thoughts and words. 6 hours later, while departing the Lorraine Hotel for a planned dinner at a local reverend's home, Doc received the worst injustice when an assassin's bullet found its mark. The Poor People's Campaign. In November of 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference decided to undertake the Poor People's Campaign in an attempt to demand economic justice for the nation's poor.
We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life, nor liberty, possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor.
After King's unjust assassination on April 4, 1968, which led to widespread rioting in most major American cities, King's longtime friend and fellow civil rights activist, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, stepped in to fulfill King's vision of a mass protest on Washington, D.C., while the Reverend Jesse Jackson stepped in as city manager to what would become known as Resurrection City. Busloads of a broad coalition of Native Americans, white, Latino, and African Americans began arriving into the district on May 12, 1968, occupying the 15-acre makeshift tent city near the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, holding daily protests against federal lawmakers' dogged inaction on poverty. For the next 6 weeks, some 2,700 protesters endured harsh living conditions, including rain, mud, heat, and high humidity, as well as frequent clashes with police. The beleaguered demonstration culminated with the Poor People's March of June 19, 1968, with an estimated 50,000 people in attendance, including speeches by Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Democratic presidential candidate Eugene McCarthy, Abernathy, and King's widow, Coretta Scott King. Distracted by ongoing racial tensions and the Vietnam War, the Poor People's Campaign came to an end on June 24th, when a 36-day permit terminated the demonstrators' legal right of assembly, and when 500 protesters refused to vacate their soggy encampment. Authorities used tear gas to disperse the remaining crowds. More than 100 protesters were arrested during the melee, including Abernathy, and while the Poor People's Campaign failed to bring about any significant anti-poverty legislation by Congress, it marked the first time that the civil rights movement expanded beyond demands for racial equality to include interracial class issues and economic goals for the nation's poor, making the Poor People's Campaign the last bold act of nonviolent protest by a nation's revered and fallen hero. The Memphis Sanitation Strike. Working long hours in every kind of weather, all for a lowly 65 cents an hour, or $5.62 in today's currency. When 2 Memphis sanitation workers were crushed to death by a faulty garbage truck compactor, 1,300 Memphis sanitation workers walked off their jobs when city officials refused to provide compensation to the deceased workers' families. On February 23, 1968, after Memphis Mayor Henry Loeb refused all concessions to the striking workers, police assaulted peaceful protesters with tear gas, prompting Nashville professor and civil rights activist Reverend James Lawson to call on his friend Martin Luther King Jr. with the hope of drawing attention to the strikers' plight. Building on MLK's Poor People's Campaign, which advocated for underprivileged Americans, on March 18th of that same year, King addressed a crowd of some 25,000 people about the dignity of labor by saying, "Whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity, and it is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth." 10 days later, King returned to Memphis for another I Am a Man protest, which led to the death of an African-American teenager when an outside group infiltrated the Sanitation Workers' March. King would return to Memphis on April 3rd, delivering his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech, which proved to be a tragic foreshadowing of his assassination the following day.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
While MLK's assassination sunk a nation into deep mourning and widespread civil unrest in major American cities, it also overshadowed the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, prompting King's still grieving widow, Coretta Scott King, to return to Memphis to spotlight the cause of underpaid sanitation workers. Following Coretta's act of courageous solidarity, President Lyndon Baines Johnson sent his Undersecretary of Labor to Memphis to help mediate an equitable agreement. 2 weeks later, Memphis leaders officially recognized the workers' union while granting generous pay raises for its members, making the Memphis sanitation strike a bittersweet milestone during the heated years of the civil rights movement. The Orangeburg Massacre. Despite passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial segregation in the United States, not everyone, particularly in the Jim Crow South, bought into the principles of racial equality, including Orangeburg, South Carolina businessman Harry Floyd, who continued to deny blacks into his bowling alley under the wrongful belief that federal anti-segregation laws had no jurisdiction over private property. In a town with two predominantly black universities, South Carolina State and Claflin University, educated blacks appealed repeatedly for entry into Floyd's bowling alley, who refused their advances in the name of his long-standing white clientele. After students were again denied entry on February 5th, 1968, a day later, an even larger crowd arrived in protest, drawing the immediate ire of police, who beat students mercilessly with billy clubs. The night would witness 15 student arrests, 10 student injuries, and 1 wounded police officer. Campus outrage spread like wildfire, prompting Governor Robert McNair to call in the National Guard in advance of anticipated civil unrest by what he called outside black militant agitators like Cleveland Sellers, who would return to his native South Carolina after graduating from Howard University in 1967. Commanded by Police Chief Pete Strom, when an even larger protest erupted on February 8, National Guardsmen and heavily armed police blocked the entrance to SC State, prompting students to build a bonfire in protest of their confinement. After firemen responded to Strom's order to extinguish the blaze, when an officer was struck by a heavy wooden banister, police opened fire on the unarmed students, creating instant pandemonium as terrorized students fled for their lives. After the shooting was over, freshman Sammy Hammond died from a bullet wound to his back, while 17-year-old Delano Middleton, whose mother worked on campus, passed away from 7 gunshot wounds. 18-year-old Henry Smith also lost his life following 3 bullet wounds, while 28 others, including Sellers, were shot or wounded during their scramble for safety. Media coverage remained almost non-existent from the start, due primarily to the recent distractions of the Tet Offensive, which was a coordinated string of North Vietnamese attacks in more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and outposts just days earlier. Of the 70 armed police officers involved in the Orangeburg Massacre, 9 were indicted, but ultimately all 9 were acquitted, while Sellers was convicted and sentenced to 1 year's hard labor for inciting a riot, making the Orangeburg Massacre a largely unknown and unsung tragedy in America's slow embrace of equal rights. George Wallace. Born in 1919 Clio, Alabama, George Corley Wallace earned his law degree from the University of Alabama, graduating in 1942 before his voluntary enlistment into the U.S. Army during World War II. Serving as Assistant State's Attorney in 1946, Wallace was elected to 2 terms in the state legislature before his election to the bench of the 3rd Judicial Circuit Court in 1953. Losing his first bid for the Alabama governorship in 1958 to a segregationist candidate endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, Wallace became known as a fighting judge due to his defiance of a federal civil rights investigation into Alabama's ongoing discrimination against African American voting rights. Wallace's growing reputation as a segregationist won him his first of 4 governorships in 1962, following up on his campaign promise in June of 1963 to stand in the schoolhouse door when federalized National Guardsmen forced Wallace to capitulate on his attempts to block black students from enrolling at the University of Alabama. His actions and hardline segregationist pronouncements made Wallace the national face of deeply entrenched racial segregationist sentiment held by many white Americans. And when he ran as a third-party candidate during the presidential election of 1968, he captured 13% of the vote, mainly from states in the Jim Crow South. During his second term as governor, Wallace embarked on a second campaign for the Oval Office until he was shot during an assassination attempt on May 15, 1972, an event which left him paralyzed below the waist for the remainder of his life. Serving 2 more terms as Alabama governor, by his final run for office in 1982, Wallace had renounced his segregationist ideology and sought reconciliation with civil rights leaders, receiving substantial support from black voters before retiring from politics in 1987 due to rapidly declining health. Developing Parkinson's disease during his final years, Wallace died of septic shock on September 13, 1998, ending one of the last segregationist voices during the final years of the Jim Crow South.